Hello everyone. We are welcome to this roundtable organized by the International Studies Association, jointly put together by the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the ISA and the Global South Caucus. Today we have gathered to deliberate on one of the most topical conflicts in the Global South, the challenging division, conflict, war, and destruction currently ongoing in Ethiopia. In the last few days, there have been many new developments in the war, compounding months of suffering by Ethiopian and Tigray citizens. And we are here as mainly Africans and concerned citizens of the world to talk about the way forward in terms of resolving this conflict and in terms of protecting civilians, especially women and other vulnerable persons. We would like to take this moment to just say a big thank you for the support of the ISA Executive Director and his team at this time. And I will quickly introduce the speakers at today's roundtable. With us on the table are Rowena Kasai of the Tigrayan Youth Network. The Tigray Youth Network is a youth-led NGO registered in England and Wales that aims to inspire Tigrayan youth and bring together the Tigrayan diaspora to enrich and protect the lives of Tigrayans home and abroad. You're welcome, Rowena. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you at this time Dr. Jonas Adeto, who is the director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. Dr. Adeto's research is in the areas of peace building, conflict resolution, ethnic relations, development, and in particular, he has conducted research on conflict complexity in Ethiopia. You're welcome, Dr. Adeto. We also have with us Professor Earl Conte Morgan, who is of the International Studies Department at the University of South Florida. He is a former senior research fellow at the Norwegian Nobel Institute, Oslo. He has published extensively on human security, conflict and peace building, state failure and the impact of globalization on state cohesion and similar topics. Welcome, Professor Conte Morgan. And moderating the session today with me is Dr. Sipokazi Magadla, who is senior lecturer in the Department of Political and International Studies, Rhodes University, South Africa. A former Fulbright scholar, Dr. Magadla's research has examined women's roles in the armed struggle in South Africa and their participation in the state-assisted demobilization and integration into civilian life in post-apartheid South Africa. It's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Magadla. I am Olajumoke Jacob Haliso. I'm co-chair of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of ISA, and I teach at Babcock University in Nigeria. Let me warmly welcome everyone who has taken the time to attend this roundtable today. Please feel free to share your views, make contributions, ask questions. Please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen for questions and comments at the appropriate time. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Dr. Sipokazi Magadla to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacob Haliso, for bringing us together. Greetings to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important roundtable on the war in Ethiopia. The announcement of the state of emergency on Tuesday demonstrates the urgency in which we need to collectively come together to understand and name the intersections of historical, political, social, economic, local, regional, and global forces that have brought the country to this tragic moment of violence. To understand, name, and suggest ways out of violence and destructions requires intellectual courage, principle, and an ethical commitment to the people and place. Cornel West calls this tragicomic hope. which is the ability to hold on to hope, even in the midst of deep despair. As Ethiopians, neighbors of Ethiopian people, Africans and Africanists, we despair about what is happening in Ethiopia and about what is happening in Sudan. Before we begin, I would like us to hold in our thoughts, in our prayers, in our meditations, loved ones, comrades, fellow Africans in Ethiopia and Sudan. I would like us to do that by pausing for a moment of silence, which begins now. Thank you, colleagues. The structure of these conversations will take 2 rounds. I will invite our 3 speakers. Our 4th speaker might be able to join us, but if she's not able to do so, it gives our 3 panelists more time. We have asked them to respond to 2 questions, taking 5 minutes at a time. So I will invite the speakers to respond to the first question and then move on to the second round. Rowena Kasai will respond to this first question. A year into the Ethiopia-Tigray civil war, why has a political resolution not been reached? What can the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the African Union, and the United Nations do to facilitate an end to this war? Over to you, Rowena.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to you all for inviting me here today and for arranging this discussion. I feel like it's a pertinent issue and it's one that has been belittled, denied, and cast aside by so many in an attempt to gaslight survivors, further dehumanize the Tigrayan population, and continue a reign of terror that has at present reached a year. In answering your question, firstly, this week marks a year since the war in Tigray began, and the Ethiopian government remains committed as ever, as it was last November, to continue the siege on the region, block humanitarian access, and continue the campaign of violence extended towards Tigrayans in the region and outside. And we've effectively seen what a government can do when they have been emboldened by the inaction of the international community. The national government of Tigray has maintained its position in unequivocally calling for a peaceful resolution, as opposed to the Ethiopian government, which insists on pursuing military action for an inherently political conflict. Abiy Ahmed's government has continuously ignored calls from the elected government of Tigray, where they have stated a set of preconditions for a ceasefire and negotiation with the federal government of Ethiopia, one of which was unfettered humanitarian access. This was refused, and in response, the national government of Tigray was dubbed a terrorist group. As of June 28, 2021, the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire, citing the Ethiopian National Defence Force was withdrawing from the region, quote, to enable farmers to till the land. Since the end of June, the Ethiopian government has remained determined to target Tigrayans within and outside of the region, whilst continuing the use of starvation as a weapon of war. I'd like to continue with saying the Ethiopian government, following the Ethiopian government's call for a ceasefire in June, in the week commencing Monday, 18th October, which is not that long ago, the capital of Tigray, Mekelle, was bombed. And in so a 2-week period of artillery strikes began, targeting Mekelle, Tembe, Adwa, and Maitebri. In doing so, residential areas, a known open marketplace, a university campus, a textile factory, and a hospital, near a hospital, were bombed. There have been countless occasions in which Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed himself and other government officials have called for the extermination of Tigrayans, in which he referred to Tigrayans as the cancer of Ethiopia and vowed to remove what he referred to as an invasive weed. The president of the Amhara region, Agenyehu Teshaggar, was quoted saying, "We can't have peace until we wipe out the Tigrayan people. These people are the enemy of the Ethiopian people." Most recently, as you mentioned, in this emergency, the Ethiopian government have intensified these calls for attacking the Tigrayans, especially in the capital city. The head of Peace and Security Bureau, Keneha Yadeta, informed a news outlet that residents of Addis Ababa were to work in tandem with security forces to conduct surveillance. Residents of the city have been called to cooperate with security checkpoints set up in various areas, including residential homes, to ensure peace, under the guise of ensuring peace. So these instances and many others are indicative of a government unwilling and incapable to accept calls for a political solution, because it's evident they are intent on continuing this inherently violent rule, as opposed to finding solutions that would give way for lasting peace in the country. Thank you.
Rowena, can I ask you to speak to the second part of the question, which is, what can the African Union, IGAD, United Nations do? Thank you.
Definitely. Well, as we all know, IGAD is an entity that's established to promote peace and prosperity, and this past year has been an example in how they have failed enormously to do that. After a year of silence, facing continuous calls from Tigrayans and the government of Tigray for a ceasefire and negotiations, it's clear that the IGAD have been serving the interests of the Ethiopian government. IGAD and its member states and the African Union have been silent about the atrocities taking place this year. Yesterday, however, we saw a change. IGAD joined the EU in calling for a ceasefire, and we saw Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni announce an IGAD meeting would take place to discuss the war on November 16th. Facilitating an end to the war would mean IGAD would have to call for an actual ceasefire, open national dialogue and negotiations, unrestricted humanitarian access, which would have to be monitored by non-government entities to end the blockade and the siege on the region. Additionally, the UN should impose a deadline to ensure the monitored removal of Ethiopian, Amhara, and Eritrean forces still in Tigray, occupying and indiscriminately arresting, killing, and raping in Western and Eastern Tigray, and insist on all-inclusive national dialogue to address the fundamental political differences driving this war. It would also need to conduct investigative reporting with the UN and other international organizations, separate from any joint report with a government agency like that of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and UN Human Rights. Only in doing that will investigative reporting accurately record and measure the atrocities waged against Tigrayans.
Thank you very much, Rowena. Dr. Adeto, can I invite you to please respond to the same question in 5 minutes?
Right, thank you very much indeed for particularly your somber, very African way of paying tribute to those who remain victims, and thank you so much for that respect, which definitely outlines who really we are. We are part of each other, and we are Africans at the same time. It is absolutely unfortunate for us to see one country fighting within itself and with itself, I would possibly say. So I just like to very quickly mention context is key in social research, and why in the first place this war had taken place. Why is it? Very quickly, for 27-30 years, TPLF-led EPRDF followed a path of ethnic politics that divided Ethiopia deeply. In 55 African, the AU member countries, or 193 UN member countries, you cannot find an article which would say each and every nationality have a right to secede, go away, break away. I was just comparing particularly the African constitutions, and in Rwanda, it is crime to organize politics around ethnicity. In Kenya, you can't do that. In 55 countries, to be honest. So this very political philosophy of TPLF-led EPRDF governments remains a structural cause. For 2016, uprising, entire uprising against down TPLF, down EPIDF was there across Ethiopia. As a result, all EPIDF leaders, including TPLF, publicly came out and apologized that they made mistakes. So they admitted their mistakes, that the politics, that ethnic politics does not work at all. So in 2018, in Hawassa, they themselves, the TPLF, EPIDF together, elected Dr. Abiy Ahmed at the same time. This is just in record, you can possibly see it. Then that's the structural aspect. What triggered this current conflict? Simple, as you have seen, current BAS report from US State Department. The TPLF, after having elected Abiy, then refused to join the United Ethiopian Prosperity Party, and then went their own way and held their own election and totally decimated the northern command of Ethiopian army. And that is in record, and it's been internationally acknowledged. And you can also see we have all the evidence for you to show. By the way, civility of discourse is foundation of democracy and respect. So anything we say here must be credible, could also be replicated, cross-checked, and then people can see whether what we are claiming to be true is true or not. They can cross-check it as well. So that must definitely be understood. Plus, whatever I utter here, we say here, must also be to the standard of the audience. I really have high standard from the very outset. The way you have structured and angled and framed the very debates definitely shows the respect, the integrity of the entire audience. So that must really be an underlying principle for us as we enter into conversation. So here I'm stating the fact as it is happening on the ground. So that triggered, that is decimating Ethiopian army by Sekou Touré and TPLF leaders as a whole, as part of balkanizing and destabilizing Ethiopia as a whole. Time and again, Getachew Reda, a spokesperson of TPLF, would say, so as to destroy Ethiopian state, Ethiopia as a whole, we would go to hell if need be. It's a record, I have it here, if you want to listen to it in Amharic, and then we can translate it to English as well. And that destabilizing situation then led them to Afar region. I'm very happy in your summary here, you indicated the massacres of Maikadra, again by TPLF led. And at the same time, how many IDPs? Absolutely, I would agree with my sister and when she was mentioning the rapes, definitely rapes committed in Amhara, in Afar, and at the same time in Kamise areas, in Tigray as well. Absolutely, I fully agree. And that's what also Human Rights Commission, the Ethiopian Rights Commission, the day before yesterday, publicized, which is already published, down there in record. And what's true or what's not true is over there. And as scholars for us, we really can't digress. We are not to win debate, but rather show the truth so that we can understand the problems and come back to solutions. So fundamentalism, the structural cause is that ethnic politics, and the triggering cause was that immediately killing part of Ethiopia in general by TPLF, as they themselves, as again, have acknowledged. Sadkan, and we're working together with our colleagues. We have also conversations even how to gain peace by peaceful means, honestly speaking. But then they just unfortunately went with a war. Why? What should be done? I think African-led solution for me is primary. In Ethiopia, before the war took place, women ambassadors went to Mekelle so as to beg TPLF leaders. Religious leaders went to Mekelle so as to beg to bring TPLF leaders to the table to discuss, through discussion, how to non-violently resolve differences. That was the principle. All elders using Ethiopian African way of settling differences, but they outright refused and then went into this. And this is true or false. We have all the documents, it's also international documentary, you can cross-check. As I said, anything we say, we must be able to walk the talk. and it should be also cross-checked as well in a record. And IGAD, AU, UN, I have to really quickly mention one of the grand plan in this fight is from the very outset. In 1991, when TPLF and EPLF, Eritrean People Liberation Front, and at the same time DERG, the military government, when the State Undersecretary for African Affairs, Herman Cohen, negotiated, they were almost to put TPLF as representing the interest of West, the Western government, particularly the American government. And now the Western propaganda against Ethiopia, as well as neighboring countries, honestly speaking, is not genuine concern for the population, but rather why Ethiopia should claim to be a national, why Eritrea should claim to be a national independent entity, rather it should be puppets and serving our interest, because we want to control entire Africa through Ethiopia, through Eritrea. There are China, Russia, and others coming through. Therefore, sort of the elephants metaphor, which you have used in your excellent paper here, which you sent all of us to us. So honestly speaking, the way out is in our hand, in African sand again. It is just a matter of political will, and particularly, as I said a moment ago, already many people have tried, friends tried, and whether what I've said right or wrong, you are to cross-check it and you are to see it. So if the criminals who were suspected by the Ethiopian Supreme Court were handed over, and the war definitely can come to the end, the negotiation can get started. That's what we can possibly do. And there is a way, there is a hope as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adeto, for drawing a national context. And Rowena told us that there's been a resounding regional and continental silence to the very complicated local and historical context that has led to this particular war. Dr. Muyoka, I'm going to give you some time to settle in. So I'm going to invite Prof. L. Kote Morgan to respond to the first question, and then we'll conclude this first round of reflections, of contributions with your input. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Dr. Magadla. I think, to be specific, the Ethiopian conflict is actually a result of the difference between two visions of Ethiopia. I think Dr. Adeto touched on that. The first vision is an ethno-linguistic, in fact, vision of the country supported by the TPLF leadership. And of course, throughout their reign, they actually underscored that. Then, of course, an opposing vision of Ethiopia is for the country to be centralized and de-ethnicized, if you can use that word, so that Ethiopia becomes maybe more like Kenya and other striving democracies. The Prime Minister's decision in 2019 to actually merge regional ruling parties into a single unitary one further strained, in fact, relations with the TPLF. In other words, Prime Minister Abiy wants a united Ethiopia that de-emphasizes ethno-linguistic regions in terms of politics. The specific is that 8 of the country's governing parties all except the TPLF joined to form what they now call the Prosperity Party. The Prime Minister wanted to end the reality of Ethiopia being a constitutional ethnic federalist state to one where ethnicity is in fact de-emphasized. I know Ethiopia, if you go back to history, I'm not an expert in that region of the world or on Ethiopia. It's actually an empire. In other words, brought together by, if I'm not mistaken, Menelik II, then later on trying to be reinforced by Haile Selassie, the emperor. And so that's what history has done to Ethiopia, in fact. Now, what further strained relations between the Prime Minister and the TPLF was the rapprochement between the federal government and Eritrea. Eritrea, of course, now an independent state. The Prime Minister reached out to them. That was probably the major reason why he won the Nobel Peace Prize, trying to bring about peace. It was seen, of course, this rapprochement was seen by the TPLF elite as an alliance against them. Tigray leadership had led Ethiopia, just as Dr. Jonas has said, during the 1998 to 2000 war between the two nations over Eritrean independence. And so in Ethiopia, what you have right now is like axis to grind, in history, this one trying to say, oh, you did that to me, and I'm going to do that back to you, or you are dislodging me from power, and I have to fight back. Of course, then you come to the precipitating factor that led to the war that is being, in fact, carried out right now, the postponement by the Prime Minister of elections. And of course, Northern Tigray decided, no, we are not going to go by those elections. There are many other, of course, factors that I can bring in, but let me address the second part of the question to a certain extent. Right now, probably what is needed is a national dialogue, because we always have to deal with the question of sovereignty. And Ethiopia is not like Rwanda, small country. Ethiopia is a big country with lots of regions. So the UN can't just say, well, we are coming with our troops and we're going to, in fact, do peace enforcement, do war, do battle against any faction that doesn't want to support a national dialogue. But a national dialogue should be encouraged by the United Nations, by the, as Dr. Ola said, by the elephants in the room. The US, the EU, all of them, the AU, all of them should push pressure both sides for a national dialogue. But before that takes place, there should be, in fact, an addressing of the humanitarian catastrophe that would, in fact, inflame sentiments, because we are not on the ground, we don't know, but many reporters are saying that people are starving. Yesterday, I was watching the BBC, and I saw, in fact, women sitting down, and you could tell that they were starving, the children were starving. And so those things have to, in other words, food should be allowed to go in. The AU and all the big elephants should press for, in fact, humanitarian agencies to get full access, for, in fact, human rights commission agents to get full access to report on what is happening in Ethiopia. In other words, there should be unrestricted access, especially for food, and of course, for investigations. I will stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Prof. L. I'm going to come to you, Dr. Sela. And Prof. L ends at the point where Rowena started us by painting this painful picture of the year of loss, the year of destruction, the year of displacement, and what she calls a silence, a regional, a continental, and a global silence. Can you reflect for us about what needs to happen to lead to the immediate loss of lives and the destruction that Prof. L has ended on, and who needs to do what? Over to you, Dr. Sela.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. to join in this very critical conversation. I apologize for coming in late because I had technical issues. It's a little after 5, as you know, in East Africa. And I think also everybody's just coming off work. It's a Friday. Somehow I just couldn't get online, so I'm very sorry. But the issue at hand is that we have a very serious conflict going on in the northern part of Ethiopia. And it really is unfortunate that we have lost so many lives and a lot of suffering is going on in Ethiopia. And although I came in late, but I did hear some pointers, we haven't had a very loud voice from Africa. What we are hearing is statements coming out of the United States and the European Union. You know, we've had really aggressive conversation encouraging a ceasefire and so forth. And parties to the conflict really just ceasing hostilities and considering sitting at the table. And these are the conversations we should have been having from our African leaders. So honestly, as I sit here with all of you, my colleagues, I don't understand what is happening. We have the African Union, we have IGAD, and yet we have not had a rigorous conversation from these institutions about what is happening in Ethiopia. I'm sitting in Nairobi right now, in Kenya. And until recently, you know, there were no reports even on TV about what was going on in Tigray. This has been going on from November of 2020. And when reports started to come out that the TPLF, together with OLA, want to march to Addis, that's when we have now begun to see the local media, I think here in East Africa, in Kenya specifically, scrambling and quickly zooming into Addis. And so we have a problem, because why did we not think that what was going on in Ethiopia should concern the rest of us, even if we're not there? Because it does have implications for the entire region. And so I just thought I should put that out there. I also had a comment about the joint report that came out. Frankly, there's a lot of conversation. You could just have a whole presentation on that report alone. Questions around the quality and the rigor of the research that went into it, and so forth, which I wouldn't possibly want to go into it, but we have to think about the way forward. I just thought, because my expertise is mostly in gender and sexual violence, I thought I should just make a point out on that first before I say about maybe how we can move forward my suggestions. It is very unfortunate that very often when there is armed conflict, when there is war, women tend to bear the greatest brunt. In the case of women in Tigray, I think they have really carried the burden of being violated in the most heinous ways. And at this point, don't even know how many women really have been sexually violated, assaulted. And I want to say that just based on the report that came out 2 days ago, the UN joint report with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, you have women that were violated even in front of their little children, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. This was what was going on. You have women that after the violation that they went through, they may never have children again in their lives. So even as we talk about thinking about the way forward, we have to think about what Ethiopia will do insofar as trying to address these violations against women. I think, from my perspective, I think that the violations that have happened here would qualify as international human rights violations. In fact, they fit so many different categories. You know, they fit, I think, as the question of genocide or rape, I think we haven't had that conversation very much, but I think that anyone that is thinking about Ethiopia and the sexual violence that's happened there, they need to think critically about whether this was genocidal or not. And we need to relook at the evidence that's been presented. And because Amnesty International also did a very good report some months back. Anyone that's really interested, we need to relook at that and not be afraid to really question and scrutinize what has happened to Tigrayan women and girls and what we could call that. you know, because I know that sometimes when we hesitate in terms of terminology, then if we hold back and say we will not call it a genocidal act, that way we don't have to take responsibility for what's happening. But given all of the gross violations that have happened there, as evidence begins to mount, I think that any serious scholars must revisit this question. Insofar as what do we do now? I think that we need to hear more from the AU and IGAD. I think that we should not focus too much on the United States and European Union to lead the conversation. This conflict is happening on the African continent, on the motherland. We should rather be leading this conversation. We need to see we see our leaders go beyond the idea of saying we are concerned about what's going on, because now we've gone beyond concern. It's been a year of suffering, of serious suffering. The children have died, children have been maimed, women, the same thing. So we need to go beyond issuing these statements and really figure out how can we have something tangible that we can take on that will help to bring these hostilities to a close. It is the reason why we have, you know, all of these instruments that we developed to allow, international instruments to allow us to be able to address conflicts, you know, anywhere around the world. So how can we, I could make this as a statement or a question, how can we make, for example, IGAD more active, more rigorous in this issue? IGAD right now is chaired by Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, who happens to also be the Prime Minister of Sudan. And we know that there is an ongoing crisis in Sudan right now because of the coup that happened there. But we also have the Executive Secretary, who is, I think, Dr. Wakne from Ethiopia. I apologize if I pronounced it wrong. But yeah, perfect. So you can see the tricky issue here. It's very sensitive because you have the very people at the top of the IGAD structure, almost the same parties whose countries are involved in some kind of conflict or tension, political misunderstandings between these two, Sudan and Ethiopia. So what do we do? How does IGAD move forward from here to be able to address this? Can IGAD really address this despite the fact that Abdallah Hamdok has his country also has some kind of conflict with Ethiopia? What happens? What about the AU? Has the AU used its power enough? I mean, they have a whole department whose sole purpose is peace and security. Mind you, I want to say they had a conference here that just ended yesterday. So this unit that is addressing the questions around conflict, what more can they do? They're sitting in Addis Ababa. Is there anything more than just issuing statements that they can do to ensure that, no, we really bring the parties in the conflict to the table and try to talk some sense so that the suffering stops, so that the blockade that is preventing humanitarian aid from reaching areas of Tigray can be removed, you know. And also I want to say, I don't know if you guys have been seeing this, I am an active Twitterer, I'm on Twitter a lot, and every day I'm seeing a lot of vitriol around, anytime you see conversations around the conflict, different people have different interpretations of what they think is going on, what has led to the conflict, who is the aggressor, etc. And it has really gotten to I think, fever pitch at this point. And so in that respect, I think also Ethiopian leaders, yes.
Can I ask you to just finish that sentence and then ask you to hold your second reflections for the second round?
Sure. Yes, I was just going to say, I think we also need to think about how do we reduce or address this question of the hate speech and so forth, just to be able to calm down a little bit on this very tense conversations around the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masundi. And
Sure.
The point that you finish on is around hate speech, is around naming, that words have names. They either empower us to do something, or they allow us to unsee what is really happening. And I think that's very important. And here you use the word genocide, which has huge political implications for Ethiopian leaders, for the region, in the Horn of Africa, for Africans, for the African Union, and the international community more broadly. So I would like us to move to the second and the last round, and the question that our speakers will respond to is, and in a way, Dr. Masundu has led us to the second session, what is the gendered nature of the massacres, displacement, sexual violence, and famine that has been a character of this violence? Is a resolution that takes women's particular victimhood and agency possible? And lastly, what are the political and material conditions necessary for a conflict resolution and a peace-building resolution that takes gender and women seriously? Over to you, Rowena. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start and I'd just briefly like to respond to some of the claims made earlier that also tie into this question, particularly that made by the panelist Jonas Adito, because I feel that it's particularly this type of kind of rhetoric that has permitted the Ethiopian government to commit these mass atrocities in Tigray and essentially use the bodies of Tigrayan women and girls as a tool of oppression against the pursuit of self-determination. Sexual violence is being used as retribution for exercising constitutional rights, and also the weaponization of Pan-African notions like African solutions for African problems, often heard by members of Abiy Ahmed's regime and shared by Mr. Adeto earlier, are being used as an excuse to drive Abiy Ahmed's unitary vision, which in essence denies nations and nationalities the right to self-governance. Similarly, the violence against women and girls is symbolic of Ethiopia's return to its expansionist and imperial past, and we are seeing sexual violence as a tool of war. It's being used to deny, strip, and punish the Tigrayan people from practicing their constitutional rights, and in doing so, subsequently continue the genocide against Tigrayans. There's an inherently gendered dimension of this war, which means by design, women and girls face the brunt of violence. Oftentimes, when rape is used as a weapon of war, it's used as a tool of dehumanization. As we have seen in the war on Tigray, this encompasses multiple means of subjugating an entire ethnic group. Perhaps the most pervasive, we can argue, has been seen in that of sexual violence. Sexual-based violence during conflict intends to use the victim's body as the battleground, often as a strategy of submission to defeat the enemy. This is an extension of the occupational territory by invading Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. The violation of women and girls' bodies is an extension of the conflict in Tigray, and it's degrading, inhumane, and a war crime. These are attempts to destroy the social fabric of Tigray and create irreversible damage. The violence inflicted on Tigrayan women attempts to stop them from giving birth to future generation of Tigrayans, which we have seen in the reporting by Amnesty International, CNN, and countless other Western media outlets. Because of the nature of the violence and because it's been so sinister, systemic, and against Tigrayan womanhood, it's clear that genocidal undercurrents intend to strip future generations of their Tigrayan heritage. The use of sexual violence in this war seeks to brutalize women and girls, and in targeting women and girls, speaks to the commitment of the Ethiopian government to terrorizing the Tigrayan people. Can I continue to the point of resolution
Yes.
that takes women? Sure.
Yes, you can.
Thank you. The long road to resolution must account and affirm experiences of survivors of sexual violence and ensure they have proper care, but also pursue accountability for the abuses they have suffered at the hands of Ethiopian, Amhara, and Eritrean forces. Resolution must also ensure that we as a society reshape and reframe the words we use when speaking about survivors. In doing so, this will be instrumental in ensuring survivors' autonomy and agency are centered in the rebuilding process. It must also acknowledge that women play a fundamental role in transitional justice. In cases of wartime rape, transitional justice mechanisms play a significant role in effective justice, reconciliation, long-term peace, and stability. Such mechanisms aid in the introduction of reparation payments, international criminal courts, and tribunals. As we saw with the Rwandan genocide, the ad hoc international tribunal established by the UN Security Council represented the start of a judicial precedent in the field of gender-based criminal prosecution. Modern mechanisms of transitional justice prioritize accountability and an end to impunity through the established rule of law, justice, and truth. As such, it intends to reflect a victim-centered approach. Prioritizing reintegration serves to foster greater success in subsequent goals of transitional justice. Implementing this, I believe, will allow survivors to gain agency in their healing process while honoring their experiences and accounting for real justice. I think it's the fourth part of the second question, which speaks about political and material conditions necessary for conflict resolution. In targeting this, I believe that efforts must go beyond addressing one aspect of the issues faced by survivors of wartime rape. They must address the variety of different issues that may arise. Generic post-war psychosocial trauma, psychosocial programs, for traumatized populations are not enough on their own to counteract the experienced trauma. National level policies are a means to building resolution that encompass gender and women, and governments must recognize the special needs of women and girls that have survived sexual violence and also children born of wartime rape and afford them protection, rights, and benefits. As we know, the figures used to measure the number of survivors of the wartime rape in Tigray are over 10,000, but we still are yet to confirm the exact number. So joint programs can serve interventions needed to include families and communities to promote acceptance, understanding, and inclusion, to tackle the pervasive impact of stigmatization of survivors of wartime rape. And recognition of their experiences may be a means of reconciliation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rina, for giving us an immediate picture of what needs to happen in material and also in structural terms in the long term, thinking about a peace-building project that takes justice seriously and gender justice seriously. Thank you for that. We'll now move on to you, Dr. Adeto, to respond to the second question. Earlier, you spoke about this image of two elephants, but underneath that, human beings and lives. What becomes a gendered response to this violence in the immediate term and in the long term? Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, very quickly, I think I first should very clarify when I said Pan-Africanism, why I said it. It is what our forefathers, Haile Selassie, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Nyerere, that they have been really suffering, dying for, so as to make Africa unite, because in unity lies our strengths. That's the agenda of AFCFTA, that is, free trade areas. Without having this Pan-African ideal, we cannot really think of even freeing that gender-based violence, to honestly speaking. That, that the Ubuntu thinking, I am because you are, because we are. So whatever happens to Tigray, to anyone in not only Ethiopia, across Africa, across the world, whatever happens there happens to me as well. I am because we are. So my being, that is, that Pan-African philosophy, that united philosophy definitely is a way forward. Not only me here, not only Abby or anyone else, but it is already a way out for us to get rid of poverty, poverty of intellectual, poverty of thinking, poverty of, honestly speaking, behaving as well. So I think that must be really understood, and we should really come to that. Still, we have to aim for one passport visa just for all Africa. So that's really our ideal, and I don't see anything wrong in that. With that relation is also my brother Melkesa Gemechu asked me in the chat room, very related question at the same time here, that Ethiopian nationalism, isn't it Amhara nationalism? Honestly speaking, I myself am not an Amhara. I'm almost all the time sympathized. In 1990s, early 2000s, I was promoting the idea of having multiple languages for Ethiopia so as to have truly national unity together. That is multinational Ethiopia, not ethnicizing territory and territorializing ethnicity. The EPRDF politics territorialized ethnicity. Because you belong to this origin only, then you can't be here. You don't belong to this. You are an Oromo, you are an Amhara, you are a Somali, you are a Walaita, go away from here. That really led us to killing each other. That ethnic mentality is a poison for entire Africa, for entire global South as well. So thinking together, acting together, doing together, it is that the way out for us to be free from that, again, new colonialism coming back in a different form, to be honest. When I come back to gendered violence, absolutely, gendered violence being committed just the day before yesterday, already Ethiopian human rights reports it in Afar, in Tigray, in Amhara. All those committed were out there using gender, sexual violence as a weapon. Honestly speaking, I absolutely, because I was presenting a paper for WPS, Women, Peace and Security, 2 weeks ago, and that we all should stand against that entirely. That is absolutely wrong. But what's been done, just even yesterday's report I saw, only in Amhara, over 200 women were raped, and not only raping, but also killed. Some are 8 years, some are 4 years old. It is just in the reports there. And that's weaponizing and terrorizing people from being themselves, from claiming that these people claim it's their natural right to exist. And that must definitely be dealt with. And no excuses, no politicizing, or no diplomacy is either. So we really need some radical attitude towards that. And the political, the materials, I think we need commitment from governments, non-government actors, academia, the media, African Union level. You have FemWise and many others. So I think that is a very serious. I have a daughter and a boy. I have a mother, I have a wife, and what's been done in Cambodia, I was just told a moment ago from reliable sources that a wife was raped in front of her husband, and a mother in front of her own son, and none, N-U-N, who just, female priest, if you like, just in the monastery after burning the church, then such atrocities, some are really even not up to our standard to discuss at this highest level with you, to be honest. So these atrocities are being committed. I'm absolutely saddened by that. I can't agree more with Professor Earle when he raised that absolutely excellent way of saying it is conflict of visions, absolutely, conflict of visions. I couldn't agree more. It is either have your small state in a clan-based or have greater, wider, better, prosperous Ethiopia. That's the question. And that's really going on, which with implication, of course, imagine Ethiopia had balkanized states. Then my sister saying about regional security complex, how much what happens in Ethiopia affects in Kenya, immediately the Kenyan state of living, Somalia, Sudan. Simply this regional approach, Pan-African approach, is absolutely important. IGAD has been done, yes. Yeah, okay, fine. I think we should stop there. If there are more questions, I'm happy to respond to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Dr. Adeto. Prof. Kote-Morgan, can I please invite you to also respond to this final question? And then we will receive more questions during the Q&A.
You're muted.
Are you struggling to unmute, Prof? Oh, I see you are speaking. We
Prof.
can't hear you at all.
Prof. L,
All right, I was
Yes.
muted, but I didn't
Yes,
do
you
it. I
were.
think, all right, let's go on. The sooner
Okay.
the world realizes the seriousness of the conflict in Ethiopia, the sooner they should do something about it. For instance, right now we have like a state of anarchy, and who knows, it might get to chaos. And then of course, chaos leads to more extreme sexual violence. So let's first of all look at how complex, how intractable, in fact, this conflict is becoming. Different groups are now involved in their own struggles that we have not pointed out. Now, foremost among them are the Oromo, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group. 2 months ago, the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, announced a formal alliance with Tigrayan rebels in the north against the government of Addis Ababa, the federal government. The OLA commander said the groups had taken several towns in the west, central, and south Oromia with least resistance from government forces. They say they have been oppressed for more than a century. After decades of oppression, many ethnic groups want freedom. Now, of course, then the federal troops are backed by the Amhara factions. And what you have is like going beyond anarchy to even chaos. What does this mean for sexual violence? Because we know that, all of us know in the literature, in most civil wars, all civil wars, in fact, especially since the early 1990s in Africa, we're thinking of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so on, women and girls disproportionately pay a higher price for conflict. Same thing in the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. The literature, the journalists say that many girls have arrived alone, separated from family members. The UN raised the alarm of high levels of sexual violence in Tigray. Some of the women and teenage girls crossing into Sudan. And of course, there we have the regional dimension too that probably we need to touch upon, are pregnant already as a result of sexual violence in Tigray. They are denied abortion, of course, in Sudan, because we know Sudan is like a strict Muslim country. So some have resorted to unsafe abortion practices in refugee camps. In addition, women and girls also witnessed loved ones and friends killed, tortured. There's a high need, therefore, for psychological support, in fact. No resources, they have no resources, no income, no clothes, and sometimes they are wearing the same clothes for weeks on end and even months on end. Violence against women and girls is being used as a weapon for populations. Now, we're not apportioning any blame here to any group, whether federal troops or Tigrayan groups, because the entire nation, a very big nation, it's not like a small nation like Sierra Leone, where the UN could say, we don't care whether you give us permission or not, we are coming in to enforce peace. So what is happening now, in fact, it's moving beyond, again, anarchy to chaos. And of course, the victims are women and girls. Sexual violence is used to humiliate, to terrorize, and to traumatize an entire population. And of course, that would not just mean Tigrayans, it may mean Oromians, it may mean Amharas, and wherever conflict is going on, because other groups are involved. We tend to be so focused on Tigray, federal government, but the others are saying, we want our independence as well. Amnesty International put out a report in August 2021, and it detailed accounts of abuse, slavery, violence, and torture that women and young girls have suffered or experienced. Women have no access to healthcare services. They suffer beatings, torture, death threats, and ethnic slurs, they call it, you know, stereotyping one another. We all know that kind of behavior in ethnically diverse societies. Many survivors, in fact, were interviewed by Amnesty International, and they said they were gang raped, held in sexual slavery, and mutilated. Youngest victim, according to AI, was 10. Oldest victim was 62. Some, as Dr. Jonas has said, were raped right in front of their family members, in front of their own children. And some, of course, even pregnant women were raped. They suffered physical damages as well as psychological damages. In other words, the trauma sometimes is more enduring than the physical. And AI was very methodological about it. They took a sample, I think 63 survivors, and 28 of them identified Eritrean forces as the perpetrators of rape. Okay, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Prof. L. We end on a very difficult note, and that sometimes we talk about women when we're actually talking about children. You cannot say a 10-year-old is a woman, that is a child.
Yes.
And miscategorizing allows us to turn a blind eye. It allows us to imagine a certain kind of woman, a certain kind of person as rapeable, as the person who can experience sexual violence if we don't look at the fact that we are dealing with children, we're dealing with women, dealing with older women here. And you speak about the regional implications of sexual violence. And here, Dr. Masundi, you had said, what made neighboring countries think that they didn't have to respond, that they were not affected? And here, a year later, we're talking about these regional implications. Can you speak to us as we conclude the session about this, perhaps focusing on what can a resolution, an immediate resolution that takes gender seriously, what can it look like? And what can a long-term solution that takes gender seriously look like? Because you had already painted for us the very gendered ways in which, as Prof. L says, communities have been humiliated, terrorized, and traumatized. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say briefly that as we have conversations about the sexual violence that's gone on in Tigray during this, period of conflict, what we probably are not paying very much attention to is the ways in which the family structure as we know it has been disrupted. And for anyone that's interested in looking at research on family and war, you'll find that what war does to women is that it disrupts their ability to care for children. I know some professors, just can't think clearly right now to give you a name, but if you're interested, anyone that's interested, I can share this data. Some professors that have done very interesting research in humanitarian emergency situations suggest that actually conflict disrupts women's ability to show empathy to a child. And this in turn affects the developmental growth of said child or children. So apart from us thinking about just the rape and the sexual violence, we need to think about these women who are mothers in the context of a family. When soldiers come in and say, kill a husband, what that does to that family. And when they begin to run for their life into neighboring Sudan, for example, and arrive there completely disroute, and you have a situation where the children are really completely in a mess. in terms of their psychological well-being. So there is that. So in terms of the instruments, what can we really do? What can we really do? We need to think about really justice, I think. We have reports that have been done. The previous report has been mentioned, the Amnesty International report, and we also have the recently published report by the United Nations, the joint report. I think that we all agree that there must be some kind of accountability. Very often, even if you look at the case of Rwanda, I think one of the ways that survivors of war and war rape in particular are able to move on is if they feel that the perpetrators have been held accountable. So I think moving forward, we must be serious about how these perpetrators will be held accountable. As we speak right now, Eritrean defense forces that have been accused of committing the most vicious atrocities in Tigray, including rape and other forms of sexual violence and torture, by the way, are still in Tigray. So if we're really serious about these issues, we must ensure that the soldiers withdraw from this region because they have committed so many atrocities. They are uncountable, countless, and very vicious. So we need to see them, they just need to pull out. And we also need to go back to the table. I want to say, can we also see more African women in the international limelight, really speaking out about this? Because what's happening is that very often you're hearing a lot of noise being made in New York, possibly in DC, but we also need to galvanize as a continent, as African women, and say, no, this is enough. And we need to take our voices straight to the United Nations. We need the United Nations Security Council to pay attention. We already have Resolution 1325 that was passed so long ago. And we need to relook at this instrument. How is it being implemented as we speak in the case of Ethiopia? We need to really look at this issue. In terms of reparation, I had earlier conversation about children who are born as a consequence of war. We know that there are women who are expectant right now who are going to be having children. We also know that there are women who have been infected with HIV during this period of the war by soldiers or other combatants. We have to think about the reparations for these women that have suffered this injustice. What might this look like? I would like to say that we cannot, we shouldn't think that we can offer solutions that could just be quickly dealt with immediately. If you look at the case of Rwanda, which suffered a genocide in 1994, it's taken so many years even for them to be able to arrive at where they are right now. So even before coming to this meeting, I was contemplating and thinking, in the case of Ethiopia, we must be prepared that this is going to take time. So even when we think about reparations, what kind of reparations might women who have suffered sexual violence and their children be offered? One of the things that perhaps we shouldn't do is ignore the plight of the children who have been born as a consequence of rape. As somebody said earlier, there are women who will not be able to have induced abortions when they were raped, or such a situation where they end up just having these kids. And we know based on research that for many mothers, having children out of rape during war, it's very difficult. And for some mothers, they just don't even want to raise these kids. We need to think about what will happen to this category of children. We need to think about what type of support mothers can receive to care for these children, if they do care for them, if they do want to care for them. So those are the types of conversations we should be having, thinking about what types of interventions. We also think about psychosocial interventions for both women and children to be able to cope with the identities. In Africa, as you know, there's a lot of social stigma around rape and around giving birth to a child as a consequence of war. And many times women are ostracized once their relatives find out that these children that they have or these pregnancies they carry are coming out of a situation of gang rape or something like this. So we also have to think about perhaps we're here trying to figure out how we help each other as countries, help Ethiopia move forward. So we have to think about what can we do to help these women be able to find some sense of social acceptance in society, so that they can be able to care for their children, and those who don't have children but were raped to be able to just.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masundi. And I wonder if in the future, with time, we might also be able to find out that the sexual violence, maybe there's also specific sexual violence directed to men. We found out that there were specific ways in which that happened in the political violence in Kenya, for example. And so what happens when we choose not to name it for what it is? And what are the implications for the future? And I love this point around what can reparations that take gender seriously, what can those look like? And this point around accountability is very important. I live in a South African context where we recognize that apartheid was a crime against humanity, and yet there's barely any accountability in terms of the people that implemented apartheid. They are survivors and victims of the war crimes of apartheid, but hardly anyone has been held accountable. And as many Africans know, that South Africa is one of the most violent countries in this world. It's one of the unsafest places to be as a woman. So if we postpone, dealing with the legacies of these kinds of war, we only do it at our own detriment, as we see, almost 30 years later in the South African case. And so I want to close with those remarks and invite Prof. Jacob Haliso to lead us to the Q&A session. We have, I think, exactly 15 minutes to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magadla and our distinguished panelists. Some of the questions put to us by the audience have already been answered by the panelists. So, for example, there is a question concerning from Milkesa Ganechu to Jonas directly, speaking about how Abiy has tried to shift the ideological frame from ethno-nationalism to Ethiopian nationalism. And the question is pertaining to whether ethno-nationalism is not simply Amhara nationalism. Relatedly, an anonymous attendee sent a question continuing the same discussion and saying, what does the present moment say about how not feeding that imperializing, unifying narrative makes previously core members who have now become disposable because they do not feed into this ethno-nationalistic discourse. And I think Jonas has dealt with that question quite adequately. And perhaps I would call on Earl to say just a word or 2 minutes, concerning the tension between ethno-nationalism on one hand, as ethno-nationalism as a means of suppressing and basically oppressing those nationalities that do not want to be a part of the unifying narrative that the current government is putting forward, according to these questioners.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ola. The idea of ethno-nationalism was pursued for 27 or 30 years by the TPLF, because the TPLF actually dominated politics, I believe, from 1991 till 2018, and so on. And the argument against that vision is that the TPLF preferred that vision because it was a kind of divide and conquer. They dominated government, so therefore keep the others in their regions as marginalized and so on. So when Prime Minister Abiy came up with the idea of actually a federal unitary government for Ethiopia, of course, that meant the TPLF lost power when he was appointed Prime Minister. And that, of course, started the whole grudge, led to the catalyst or the precipitating factors that actually led to disobedience of the Prime Minister with regards to postponing elections and so on. So these two visions are actually, those who support them have a rigid and uncompromising attitude towards them. And that should be the focus of really a national dialogue to see where Ethiopia should move to next in terms of, because some literature says the TPLF are bitter because they lost power. When they had power, they made sure they separate, compartmentalize the country into ethnicities. And some of the ethnicities that have joined together, OLA and TPLF, for instance, they're saying they've been marginalized too long. And that's probably saying we want the vision of the current Prime Minister. But then, of course, the problem is the war is becoming more complex, intractable, and Ethiopia is becoming more anarchic. So what should be done? Besides, we know that current developments, the Prime Minister called for national emergency. Then when I saw that in the news, I said, national emergency, aren't you the federal government? You should be able to crush, a rebel group just like that. But it seems as if he doesn't have the troops or he doesn't have the capabilities. And they are moving right now towards Addis Ababa, a regional fighting force. That means they've been, in fact, combined with other groups that do not really care about his running of the country, even though they may want his vision of a united Ethiopia and so on. Now, what should be done? I don't know whether I've answered that part of the question. I think we need a real multilateral project. Now, if the world cares about Ethiopia, I can say our mother country for all Africans, the country we look to that never got colonized, the UN, the NATO, the EU should look at it as a right to protect all Ethiopians. But what usually happens in peace building, post-war reconstruction, is the idea of putting the state back together, put Humpty Dumpty together. And then as soon as Humpty Dumpty is together again, there is a government, then they pull back. Instead of addressing all the grievances of the different groups. And those grievances are usually material grievances, or society building grievances. As soon as they put the political structure together, they call the state, then they pull back. What needs to happen is something like making sure there is a rule of law, there's an end to corruption, there's job creation, there are institutional reforms for the police, for the civil service, and of course there is access to basic human needs for everybody. Because a lot of people, I would say, even, let's take the United States for instance. I live in the United States here. A lot of people don't even vote. Why? Because they have more than basic human needs. If I have a good job, I eat well, I live in a nice house, sometimes I forget the elections. I say, oh, there was an election last week, I didn't even know, I didn't register. But people become very politicized when they are actually suffering. That is, suffering because of a lack of basic human needs. That's the way I would, but Ethiopia right now, to conclude, is in a serious situation because of these contradictory and compromising attitude between the federal government. What if the TPLF takes over Addis Ababa, what happens? The Oromia may not be satisfied. The Amhara, of course, will not be satisfied. So then the whole country is plunged into anarchy and maybe even chaos. And of course, we know the outcome of that is the women and the girls who suffer the most.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. This question is for Dr. Erinat Hadeto. How could the philosophy of self-determination up to secession be the foundational reason of the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia, as it is the fundamental right of any group from the African and the West perspectives, says Jonas Abebe? Why do you think we have failed in finding a reconciliatory point between the two philosophies that have been instrumentalized by both sides, that is, self-determination on one hand and assimilation on the other hand? I think this question is basically asking how do we balance the seemingly contradictory objectives of the two sides in reaching an agreement. Dr. Adeto, please.
My apologies for leaving for just because I was still in the office and working. That's why I had to just leave. Right. I think that is a very interesting question. This balancing ethnic politics and civic politics is an attempt that's being done now. Definitely, an allegiance to an ethnic group is natural. Yes, there is nothing wrong with that. What makes it wrong then? When, as you can see, or as I mentioned, those 55 constitutions, when that ethnicity becomes an organizing principle of politics, example, political party by ethnicity is prohibited in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in any of the African countries. Please do check. Here I am with my the finest minds that they can make reference to it. Why is it the case? By the way, the very assumption itself is to be questioned. I don't know whether it should be taken as fundamental right as well, that to secede, to go away, if you want to come back. I think the Biafra case is the best case, if you like. Or I can just mention one by one, and putting secession itself, always focusing on differences rather than our similarities, definitely led us, as we saw it practically in Ethiopia, into more conflict than cooperation. And that is what practically tested. So how can we balance it? Absolutely. We have to recognize identities. As I said, in 1998, we already proposed major languages, including Afan Oromo, Somali, Afa, and these are to be used as second, third languages and national languages in Ethiopia. And that's now being already practiced, recognizing identities, languages, respecting difference, because difference to be celebrated. It is not a curse. It is rather, to me, it's a blessing, to be honest. Yeah, so that's what really I was trying to get. And when you overemphasize difference, you really end up fighting with each other. There are so many things that bring us together rather than separate us.
Thank you so much. I cannot help but go back to a point that Sela made. And Sela, I wanted you to say just a little bit more about the fact that prominent female voices have been missing in terms of condemning this war and the atrocities ongoing during this war. In fact, I had noted that not only are they missing in terms of being outside the context, also within Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a female president who is quite invisible in that landscape right now, foregrounding the fact that war and militarism are very masculinist in a way that basically erases women from the centers of power and decision making, and again reinforces the fact that the violence that women face actually is a continuum of violence, and it only becomes more apparent, more overt in times of war, and that the inequities in society which existed before the war are deepened during the war. And we see it also in the absence of women in conflicts resolution processes, peace processes, and even in the programs eventually that will be put in place for any post-conflict reconciliation and so on and so forth. Do you just want to say a little bit more about that for us? A minute.
Yeah, I'll take a minute. Thank you. Definitely, we would love to hear more being said from within, but I would also like to say that I think that within the diaspora, there's been very loud noise being made by Ethiopian women in foreign countries, living in foreign countries, but who have social media platforms. They've really pushed this out there. And yes, we would like, especially those women in power who are within Ethiopia. But I also want to say, even within the region, you know, we have, within the East African community, the countries, neighboring countries, we have women that are holding powerful positions. Also at the AU, it would be helpful to hear voices such as these being articulate about, you know, the sexual violence that has gone on. I also would like to say that I'm weary about these numbers that we are being told about how many women were raped or how many children have been born, because we must remember that this has been an ongoing conflict. You know, women have fled not only to Ethiopia, women are also fleeing to Kenya. I know that Tigrayan women are right here in Nairobi, some of them that have fled the war. So we cannot really just think that we know this number of women that have been raped or this number of children that have been born or were expectant mothers. I think that it is time we wait a little bit and then we will be able to get the accurate numbers. Also, I would like to say, African women, can we take this narrative forward? Because we can't keep on waiting for the West to tell our stories and give, you know, conversation about what's going on here. Definitely, there are allies, but it would be very helpful if we can push this narrative forward. And I think that we have begun, even just by being on this platform and talking about the experiences of women in Tigray here. Of course, we're representing, because I'm well aware that all of us here, the women in this platform today, are not Tigrayan, but at least we can be a voice for them to a certain extent. It would be helpful, for example, to see the president of Ethiopia say something. I wanted to say this, and I stand to be corrected. You know, when the conflict first started and stories started to come out, media reports started to come out about the sexual violence that was being meted on women, initially, the government of Ethiopia denied these charges, actually. But people just kept on pushing and saying, no, Eritrean soldiers are being accused of raping women. And I know I watched a couple of CNN reports of this. They were going to hospitals and talking to doctors and patients, and it became, until it became apparent that this is happening and there is just no way to hide it. So I kind of just don't know what is the current position of the Ethiopian government. It would be good to hear Dr. Adeto say something, because
the position actually is that the Prime Minister has actually acknowledged that there have been violations.
You're right. Exactly.
So that's actually out there now.
Thank you.
And called on his own troops not to stop such violations, and that if they are found, they would be made to face the law. That admission has come in very recent times. However, I think the sum of all we have been saying is that we need a multi-pronged approach to protecting civilians in this war. One of the questions was about how do we account for men who also face sexual violence, and indeed there are some of them whose cases may be more hidden than the women who face sexual violence. Whatever the case may be, I want to thank all of us for trying to be part of understanding what is going on and part of thinking through what should be done. Professor Eric Degila is chair of the Global South Caucus. He's going to simply close this session with his vote of thanks.
But maybe just two points very quickly. In this discourse, I must really thank you very much. At the same time, the role of the media, the Western media particularly, to be honest, that manufactured misinformation, fake news is really, really disturbing, more than the war itself. And I wish in the next round of discussion, we should really look at the role of the media, how it is really exaggerating and creating animosity among people, those name callings and insults, rather than uniting. dividing the entire society. I think that must have been really underlined, particularly CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and others, really, because they have been already in payroll and they have their own hidden agenda. Seriously speaking, they like to benefit from Africans fighting with each other. I think we should really be very wise there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adeto. Of course, I think several of the panelists highlighted the fact that the West has controlled the narrative, whereas perhaps Ethiopia itself needs to control the narrative, and all of us as impartial observers too can be part of shaping the narrative going forward. Thank you so much. Eric.
Yes, Ola, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the colleagues for this great conversation. I'm sorry that I joined you late because of time difference that I confused on. But this is a great conversation, and I'm very pleased that the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section and the Global South Caucus organized this event in the framework of ISA. As you know, the Global South Caucus is an academic platform dedicated to promoting the study of the South as a whole, relevant South societies, and in the North, and relations between North and South. So I'm very glad that we have been able to organize this event. I just would like to underline one point. When African leaders created in 1960s the OAU to the African Union based in Ethiopia, they promoted a strong vision of African ownership by underlying this leitmotif, try Africa first. So I do believe that regional organizations, in particular the African Union, has a key role to play, and I'm very happy that we have been able to discuss such a difficult issue and underline how the narrative from Africa is important. Thank you again to all of you.
Thank you to our audience. Thank you, our panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.